Chapter 441. Acceptance. 2. Eliana exhaled. Slow. Soft. Her body was fading. She could feel it, the end. The storm inside her had raged, fought, burned with everything it had. But it wasn't enough. The black mass within her veins still pulsed, still consumed, still won. It was over, and she accepted it. Her lips barely moved as she forced out one last whisper, her voice fragile, weak, on the verge of vanishing entirely. If we meet in another life, a slow blink, a small, tired breath, I will make sure to pay you back for everything. She let herself sink into the feeling, the weightlessness, the surrender, and in those final moments, as the last threads of her awareness unraveled, she thought of him, Lucavion, the arrogant, manipulative, infuriating bastard. How he had somehow intruded into her life, forced his way past her walls, shoved himself into her carefully built barriers without permission. How he had looked right through her ugly, bitter, broken self, and did not turn away, did not flinch, did not recoil, did not wear pity in his eyes. How, instead, he had grinned, as if he had known what lay beneath all along, as if it had never mattered. She thought of the first time he had caught her interest. That damned smirk, that casual arrogance, the way he made everything a joke until it wasn't. She thought of his cooking gods, his horrible cooking, and how he had insisted on making tea, even though she had mocked him for it. She thought of his blade, the black starlight, the way he fought, not like a man, not like a knight, but like something other, something untamed, something free. She thought of all their conversations, all the moments between the battles, the endless walking, the quiet pauses by the fire. How, without her even realizing, he had become the final entertainment in her life. A ridiculous, frustrating, unpredictable force of chaos. And yet, in this cursed place, in this cruel moment on the edge of death, she could only think of one thing. How glad she was that he had been there, even now, even at the very end. Her breath hitched. Her fingers twitched weakly against the stone. And then, she let go. Little Ember! The shout pierced through the void. Eliana's fading awareness snapped. Not fully back. Not yet, but enough to hear it. That stupid nickname. A name he had given her, thrown so casually, so mockingly, when he teased her about her hair, about her temper, about the fire in her eyes. And yet, it reached her. It was his voice, cutting through the nothingness. She could barely see. Her vision was a shattered thing, flickering in and out, her mind slipping, drowning, dying. But she forced herself to look. And then, her breath caught. Watch this. There it was. That smile. Not a smirk, not a half-lidded, knowing grin, but something pure, something unfiltered, something real. That genuine, excited expression, like a child eager to show off a masterpiece they had just created. I prepared this solely for you. His voice roared across the battlefield. And then, Lucavion moved. His long estoc shifted, its tip pointed to his right side, his right arm raised at a sharp 90-degree angle. And then, boom, his left side ignited. Real flames, actual fire, a violent, raging inferno erupted from the left half of his body, flickering with deep pitch-black embers. The heat was unnatural, distorting the air around him, burning with something more than just fire. And then, his other side, the right half of his body, his blade arm, began to swirl, a vortex of pure void. Not just darkness, not just absence, something deeper, something endless. The two forces clashed, spiraling around him. Fire and void, light and collapse, as if reality itself struggled to contain what he had become. And Eliana, she felt it. Something inside her clicked. A realization, an enlightenment, as if the world had cracked open before her eyes, revealing something more. Something, a lot more. Everything clicked. The light, blinding, obscuring, vanished. And the memory shifted, not in words, not in meaning, but in what she saw. She had thought his expression had been unreadable, detached, indifferent. She had thought his smirk had been cruel, his amusement nothing but mockery. But now she saw the truth. His eyes, they weren't pitch black. They were red. And there was a tear. A single, silent tear falling down his face. Her breath caught. Everything slotted into place. She saw it clearly now. The way his lips had trembled. Not in amusement, but in strain. The way his smirk had twitched, as if forcing itself to stay in place. The way he had pushed himself to say those words, as if every syllable was agony. The way he had needed her to hate him, right? She let out a slow, shaky breath. You bastard! Her fingers clenched. You're not good at lying at all. Because in the end, he wasn't indifferent. He had never been indifferent. He had felt every single moment of it. The silence between them stretched, the realization settling over her like a weight she wasn't prepared to carry. And then, her voice, soft, hoarse, but steady. Did you know all of this beforehand? She lifted her gaze, locking onto him, onto his expression, onto his truth. Because now, what is this? Eliana's thoughts collapsed into chaos. This was supposed to be her end, her last moment, the moment she finally let go. So why did she feel this lump in her chest? This ache that wasn't pain, that wasn't rage, that wasn't hatred. Why? Why did it feel like butterflies? Why, even as her body was breaking, as her cursed veins screamed, as she should have been consumed by agony, why was she feeling this instead? What the hell was happening? Everything looked different. The light, the air, the very world itself. Her fingers trembled, curling against the cracked stone beneath her. Don't! She barely managed to whisper the word. Because she knew what this feeling meant. It was something she had never wanted, something she had never believed in. And yet, she wanted to live now. Her eyes widened, breath catching in her throat. And then, he moved. Annihilation soared. Reverence of severity. Boom! The entire world shattered. Space itself cut. The battlefield collapsed into an abyss of distortion. The very air torn apart as an unfathomable force surged from Lucavion's blade. The void spiraled outward in a merciless tide, swallowing everything: time, space, light, existence itself, devouring the Kraken's form in an instant. Eliana couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. She could only witness. And in that moment, something else surfaced in her mind. A voice. A memory. My daughter. It was faint, distant, like a whisper carried by the wind. One day, you will meet someone who will be the sole reason for you to live. Eliana's breath hitched. Never let go of that person. The words of her mother. Words she had buried. Words she had never believed. But now, as she watched him, as she watched the very world break apart around him, as the weight of the past, the present, and the future crushed into a single moment. Ah! Her lips parted, her eyes wide in realization. I met him, and then, the world went dark. Chapter 442. The storm. Rumble. The sky trembled. A deep, resonant growl rolled through the heavens, shaking the very air itself. The overcast sky darkened in an instant, clouds surging forth like ink bleeding into water. The golden light of the sun, already weak behind the gloom, vanished. The sea, once eerily silent, began to roar. Waves that had remained unsettlingly calm swelled in an instant, rolling higher, crashing harder against the hull of the ship. The deck beneath their feet groaned as the winds picked up, sharp and biting, carrying with them the electric charge of an oncoming storm. And at the center of it all, Duke Thaddeus. His breath hitched, his body tensing as something shifted within him. Something deep, something ancient, something forgotten. A slow, throbbing pain coiled within his chest. No, his core. The mana wellspring buried deep inside him. The one he had long since tempered through decades of mastery and restraint, twisted. A crackle of unseen force rippled through his veins. He knew this feeling. He had known it since his youth, since the first time he had been forced to push beyond his limits in battle, since the first time he had tasted the raw, unrelenting fury of the sea. The storm gathered with a force beyond nature, beyond mere weather. The sky convulsed, the very air charged with raw, untamed energy. The waves surged, colliding into the ship's hull with bone-rattling intensity. And yet, beneath it all, beneath the fury of the sea, there was something else. Duke Thaddeus' breath hitched. A pulse. Not from the ocean. Not from the storm. From him. Deep within his core, something roused, something ancient, something primal. A force long held in check, tempered through decades of control. But now it stirred, restless and undeniable. Rumble. Another peal of thunder split the sky. His mana surged. The pressure around him thickened, expanding outward like the tides before a great tempest. No, not just his mana, his cultivation method. High voltage, Storm Sovereign's Dominion High Voltage. A quasi-legendary cultivation method passed through generations of the Thaddeus bloodline. It was not merely a technique, it was a bond, a command over the ocean itself. The sea bent to its practitioners, the storms yielded to them. It was what had allowed the Thaddeus family to dominate the Empire's naval forces, to rule the waters as if they were an extension of their own bodies. And now, it was reacting. Duke Thaddeus inhaled sharply as his vision blurred for a fraction of a second. He could feel it, the raw, unshackled power coursing through his veins, the ocean itself responding to him, no, not just to him, to something else. His grip on the fractured railing tightened. The air crackled around him. The sky shuddered. His mana spiraled wildly, barely restrained, as if something deep beneath the sea was calling to him. Or someone. A realization, sharp as lightning, struck him. Aliana. He barely breathed her name. But the moment he did, another shift in the storm occurred. Crack. A bolt of lightning split the sky, its blinding arc crashing into the sea with a force that sent waves towering over the ship. The ocean churned, twisting, the currents responding to his own surging mana. Idrun stumbled back, his eyes wide. The knights, hardened as they were, staggered under the suffocating weight of their duke's power. Even Reinhardt, resolute and immovable, felt it. This was not just Thaddeus mana. This was Storm Sovereign's dominion in its true form. And it was reaching out, not for destruction, not for war, but for blood, for kin, for Aliana. Thaddeus' pupils constricted as the realization settled deeper. His cultivation method should not have responded like this. It had never acted on its own. It had never called to something beyond his own command. Unless his fingers curled tighter against the railing, his breath slow, measured, struggling against the surge of power clawing to be released. Unless someone else was using it. Or unless another Thaddeus bloodline had awakened. And there was only one possibility. Only one person who could have triggered this reaction. Aliana. She was alive. She was somewhere. And the ocean itself knew it. Top of form. Bottom of form. The storm did not abate. If anything, it worsened. The sky churned like a living beast, black clouds rolling over one another in a frenzied, unnatural dance. Lightning slashed through the heavens, illuminating the deck in stark flashes of white and violet. The wind howled, shrieking like 1,000 tortured souls. But it was not the wind alone. Screams. Not human. Not beast. Something else. The cries came from all across the sky, reverberating through the air in distorted echoes. It was as if the very fabric of the world was wailing. As if something unseen, something wrong, was watching them. Duke Thaddeus' eyes narrowed. His body remained still, rigid as a steel blade drawn in anticipation. He had fought countless wars, faced foes of both men and monsters, but this was different. This was something else. The wind carried no body, no shape, nothing tangible. The screams clawed at the edges of reality, whispering, calling, taunting. And beneath them, beneath the echoes and the unnatural howling, a new sound rose. The ocean. But it was not just the waves. It was something rising from beneath. Splash. 1. Splash. Splash. 2. 3. 4. Hundreds. The first monstrous shape surged from the depths, water cascading off its twisted, armored form. Then another, and another, then an unending tide. They came like a horde, bursting from the sea in violent, frenzied chaos. Countless creatures, their bodies writhing, their malformed limbs thrashing. No, this was not like before. This was worse. Far, far worse. The sheer number of them dwarfed what the expedition had faced before. If the previous battle had been a war, this was an onslaught. But this time, the Duke was here. Thaddeus did not hesitate. His voice rang across the storm-laden deck, cutting through the wind, through the rising chaos, through the unnatural screams that clawed at the air. Mages, knights, get into position. His command was absolute. The deck came alive. Swords were drawn, shields raised. The mages began their incantations, hands crackling with arcane power as sigils ignited in the air. Archers moved swiftly, their bows already drawn, waiting for the signal. The sea churned, boiled with the sheer mass of creatures forcing their way to the surface. The water itself seemed to pulse, as if it was no longer the ocean, but something else, something corrupted, something unnatural. Thaddeus clenched his jaw, his fingers itching to draw his sword. But he did not move yet. He felt it. This whole ordeal, this monstrous resurgence, it was coming to an end. One way or another, the battle raged on. The ocean churned with unrelenting fury, countless monstrous forms surging forward in an unending tide of chaos. The knights and mages fought fiercely, their weapons cleaving through scaled flesh, their spells igniting the darkened waters in brilliant bursts of power. But the enemy's numbers were infinite. For every beast slain, another took its place. The sea itself vomited forth new horrors, relentless and unyielding. And above it all, the screams continued, a twisted, wretched cacophony of wailing voices from the sky, their cries formless, bodiless, an unnatural presence that clawed at the very fabric of reality. Duke Thaddeus cut through a monstrous beast himself, his blade glowing with crackling energy as he severed a tentacled creature in one smooth, practiced motion. But as he turned for the next strike, he felt it, a pulse, something deep in his chest, in his very core, twitched. And then, the sky split, shhhhk, a single, unimaginable slash. There was no build-up, no warning. One moment the storm raged, the next, a cut ran across the entire sky. It did not flicker, it did not flash, it simply was, an abyssal, void-like line, slicing from horizon to horizon, cleaving through the heavens as though the very fabric of existence had been severed. Duke Thaddeus froze. A shiver ran down his spine. The battlefield itself fell into eerie silence. For a fraction of a moment, even the monsters stopped. Even the sea held its breath. The cut was impossibly vast, incomprehensible. Its presence was not just seen but felt, as if the very sky, the world itself, had been wounded. Thaddeus had never seen anything like it. This was not magic. This was not power. This was beyond. His fingers twitched against the hilt of his sword, his own storm sovereign's dominion reacting violently to what had just occurred. And yet, it lasted only for a heartbeat. Then, it vanished, as though it had never been. The sky remained dark, the storm clouds still roiling, the ocean still seething. But it was different. The very air felt hollow, as if something had been removed from reality itself. And Duke Thaddeus, for the first time in decades, felt something foreign creep into his chest. Dread. He exhaled, slowly, deliberately. His grip on his sword tightened, and he whispered, almost to himself, "What in the name of the gods was that?" Chapter 443. The Storm. Something was wrong. I had pushed myself to the limit. No, beyond the limit. I had thrown everything I had at this fight, void, starlight, equinox, every ounce of power I could grasp. And yet, it wasn't enough. Even with Aliana as the medium, even with her weakening the Kraken's influence, even though its power had been dragged to something closer to a peak 5-star entity, I still couldn't overpower it. I was too strong for it to defeat me outright. but it was too deeply entrenched in this space for me to kill it. And that's when it clicked. This place, this entire battlefield, was the Kraken's own creation. I had been trying to fight it using void, using starlight, using the same forces that it was manipulating. But how could I override its authority? How could I win when I was fighting on its stage? I exhaled, blood still dripping from my lips, my one good eye narrowing as my vision blurred and refocused. TCH. Of course. I had been too caught up in refining my void techniques, too obsessed with pushing the boundaries of my Devourer of Stars core, when I had another weapon entirely, a weapon I had forgotten. Sword of Annihilation. Why did I not think of that? I had been cutting. I needed to erase. I gritted my teeth, forcing my broken body to move. I had one chance, one final moment. I glanced at Aliana, her body convulsing, her breath fading, her existence on the verge of collapsing. This was it. If I waited any longer, if I hesitated, she would die. I exhaled slowly, my vision tunneling on the Kraken as I lifted my blade one last time. And then, I did something insane. I merged them, the flame of Equinox, the Devourer of Stars. Two forces that shouldn't have been able to exist together. One was pure destruction, an all-consuming wildfire that burned anything it touched to absolute nothingness. The other was void, a force that devoured, bent, collapsed everything into itself. And now, I forced them into one. Boom! My body ripped apart. Every nerve in my being screamed, my insides fuming, tearing, disintegrating. This wasn't a fusion. It was a collision. Paradox. Fire that consumed. Abyss that devoured. I couldn't control it. I couldn't refine it. But I didn't need to, because all I needed was a single instant. I clenched my jaw, forcing down the agony, my breath sharp as I locked my gaze onto the Kraken. It was happening. Aliana's body was collapsing. The Kraken's connection to her was reaching its limit. This was the moment. I grinned, blood dripping from my lips. Little Ember. Aliana's body twitched. She was still there. Somewhere she was still fighting. Watch this. The power in my core spiraled. A clash of annihilation and abyss. A storm of pure contradiction raging through my veins. I prepared this solely for you. I moved. Boom! The world shattered. The Kraken shrieked, its massive, grotesque form writhing, twisting, distorting. And then, I slashed. One single absolute cut. A cut that didn't just slice through flesh. A cut that erased. That devoured. That burned away existence itself. Annihilation sword. Reverence of severity. And in that exact moment, when Aliana was about to die, when the Kraken was at its weakest, my blade tore through its core. And then, the world collapsed. The world collapsed. The battlefield shattered around me. The very space that the Kraken had created unraveling in a spiraling maelstrom of light and void. The cavern faded, the broken stone and debris dissolving into a vast, cosmic expanse. And there, the stars, swirling, shifting, moving in intricate patterns beyond mortal comprehension. Not the stars of the night sky, not celestial bodies shining in the heavens, but something deeper. A force, connection, the same feeling as when we were first sucked into this place, when reality itself had bent, twisted, devoured us. I exhaled, blood still thick in my mouth, my breath shallow but steady. How beautiful! But something fell. From where I had severed the Kraken's core, from the wound my blade had carved through existence itself. A lump, a mass of black liquid. It landed with a sickening, wet splatter, writhing upon the shattered remnants of the battlefield. It was shapeless, formless, shifting in ways that defied understanding. And yet, I could feel it. Something vast, something wrong, something foreign, something that should not exist. I stared at it, my pulse steady despite the unshakable weight pressing against my senses. Outsider. That single word left my lips, quiet, yet absolute. This was it. This was the thing that caused everything. The core of it all. The reason for the Kraken's existence. The reason for this entire mess. The liquid twitched, convulsing, its shapeless form pulling, reaching, not toward me, toward Aliana. TCH. At the same time I heard it, another sound, a wet, grotesque squelch. My gaze snapped to her, to Aliana. Something, the same thing, was pouring out of her as well. Another writhing mass of black liquid, seeping from her veins, from her cursed marks, escaping her body. Two identical entities, one fallen from the Kraken, one purged from her, and now they were trying to rejoin, to merge. This is how they operated. One part of the entity would leech onto a body, slowly embedding itself deeper and deeper, smearing its existence across the host like an ink stain that could never be fully erased. And the other half would take that stolen energy, that corrupted vitality, and nurture something else. Like the Kraken, this thing had been feeding off Aliana, just as it had fed off her mother. I exhaled slowly, watching as the two separate masses twitched, convulsed, and reached for one another, trying to merge, trying to survive. How desperate. My fingers tapped against my estock's hilt, my breath slow, steady. Parasitic indeed. I reached out, not for my blade this time, but for something else. A faint shimmer of mana flickered at my wrist, the subtle pulse of a spatial enchantment activating as I reached into my storage. And then, a small, ornate blackwood box appeared in my hand. Golden runes shimmered along its surface, pulsing faintly, the preservation magic still intact. Eternal Skyroot Herb, a prize won long ago, a reward I had claimed from the Marquis himself. A faint memory surfaced. The Eternal Skyroot Herb, I murmured, my smirk replaced with a thoughtful smile as I leaned back in my chair. That's quite the prize, Marquis, and you're just giving it away. The Marquis chuckled, shaking his head. I came into possession of it by sheer luck. It was part of a shipment intercepted from raiders near the northern border of my territory. At the time, I didn't realize its value. But over the years, I've come to understand just how extraordinary it is. He gestured toward the ornate blackwood box set on the table between us. This artifact serves as a preservation vessel. It keeps the herb in a state of suspended vitality, ensuring its potency remains untouched until it is ready to be used. Valeria's composed expression had cracked ever so slightly at the sight of the artifact. Even without opening the box, the sheer potency of the herb could be felt. I had smirked, brushing my fingers over the golden runes before flicking my wrist. The enchantment on my spatial bracelet activated, and the box shimmered before disappearing into storage, tucked away, reserved, for this exact moment. I knew it then. If I removed the entity from Aliana's body, she wouldn't survive. The parasite had been feeding off her for years, hollowing her out, replacing pieces of her with itself. If I tore it away completely, her body, which had long since adapted to its presence, would collapse. Just like her mother, she would die. Unless I had this. I exhaled, running a thumb over the runes on the box. In the novel, this herb had saved the male lead. And now, it would save her. I smirked. Guess it's finally time to use you. My gaze flicked toward Aliana. Let's see if we can bring you back, little ember. But just then I felt the world spinning. Cough. Chapter 444. Stars. Let's see if we can bring you back, little ember. But just then I felt the world spinning. Cough. My vision blurred. For the first time since the fight had begun, I felt it, truly felt it. The weight of my injuries, the unbearable strain on my body, the sheer toll of everything I had done. And then, my legs buckled. Thud. I stumbled, my knee hitting the cracked ground beneath me, my breath catching in my throat. I exhaled, tasting blood. I guess I pushed myself a little too far. Now that the fight was over, now that the battle had ended, my body was finally demanding what I had ignored. The shattered bones. The one eye I could no longer see from. The gashes, the blood loss, the fire burning through every nerve. Everything hit me at once. TCH. Annoying. But I forced myself to move. Because after doing all of this, I couldn't exactly sit here and die, could I? I gritted my teeth, dragging myself toward her. toward Eliana. Her body was still convulsing, still racked with pain. Her fingers clawing against the stone, her breath shallow. But she was still alive. Barely. Not for long. I lifted the eternal skyroot herb, my hand trembling slightly, and then I placed it against her body. The moment the herb touched her skin, the black mass screamed. SHLRKKKKKK. It squirmed, writhing violently, as if it were being burned, as if something was forcing it out. And then, Eliana's body began to fight back. Her breathing, once shallow, once fading, suddenly turned ragged. Her fingers twitched. The cursed veins that had long since tormented her began to pulse, but this time not in agony. In resistance. She was winning. The black parasite inside her began to expel itself, being forcibly ripped from her body. Her body was rejecting it. And the thing that had leached off her for years, that had stolen from her, that had made her suffer, was now screaming. I smirked weakly. That's right. I pressed the herb closer, watching as the black mass convulsed, recoiled. Eliana's body shuddered. The eternal skyroot herb pulsed against her skin, its energy seeping into her veins, threading through her existence like golden light in a dying ember. She absorbed it, not hungrily, not desperately, naturally, as if it had always been meant for her, as if it were restoring something that had been taken away long ago. And the black mass, SHLRKKK, twisted, shrieked, convulsed. Its writhing only grew more violent, as if it knew, as if it understood. It was losing. Its connection to Eliana, its claim over her body, its insidious grip, all of it was being erased. I watched the scene unfold, my lips twitching into a faint smirk. Not bad. I exhaled, relieved. This was it. This was how it was supposed to go. Eliana was taking in the herb's power. The parasite was being purged. Everything was working exactly as planned. And yet, my knees buckled again. I barely caught myself this time, my arm trembling as I braced against the cracked ground. The pain in my body surged all at once, unrelenting, suffocating. TCH, I had pushed myself too far. But it was fine. This should be enough, right? I had dealt with the monster. I had saved Eliana. Somehow. It should be okay now. It had to be okay now. I let out a slow breath, my vision tilting, darkening. For the first time since this whole mess started, I finally let go. And then, collapsed. Everything faded. The world went dark. Had a dream where I was wandering alone. No, not wandering. Drifting. Floating through the endless expanse of the sea, my body weightless, the vast darkness cradling me in its quiet embrace. The waves were calm, lulling me into something deep, something tranquil. Felt familiar. Too familiar. I had been here before. That same overwhelming sense of peace. That same eerie stillness. That same dark ocean stretching beneath me. Infinite and unmoving. A part of me knew what was coming next. Knew what I would see. And yet, something was different. I lifted my gaze toward the sky, expecting the same empty abyss. But instead, I saw them. Not just one. Not just the black star. But 3 others. They hovered around it, smaller, orbiting in silent synchrony. Their faint glow flickering against the backdrop of nothingness. I stared, watching, trying to understand. Why are there 3 now? Because of my cultivation. The black star was the same, unchanging, unmoving. But these 3, they were new. Or had they been there all along? I frowned, reaching out, my fingers grasping at something unseen, as if trying to bridge the space between me and those distant lights. And then, Lucavion, the voice, that voice, the one I never recognized, the one that had always called me here. The moment the sound reached my ears, the dream fractured. Everything rushed away from me, fading, vanishing, slipping through my fingers like grains of sand. The stars flickered once, and then the dream ended. Darkness embraced Lucavion's unconscious form, his body still as the echoes of battle faded into silence. Aliana lay beside him, her breathing shallow but steady, the remnants of the eternal skyroot herb's energy still coursing through her. But the battlefield itself had not yet settled. The Kraken's massive corpse twitched. Then, a surge of energy erupted from its shattered core. Starlight, an ethereal radiance coiled upward, shimmering like celestial dust drawn from the very fabric of existence. The battlefield, once soaked in blood and despair, became a stage for something far greater than mere victory. And then, that starlight fell. It descended upon Lucavion, washing over his battered form, sinking into his skin as if drawn by fate itself. His body, already pushed beyond its limits, had no strength to resist. The energy surged through him, weaving into his being like threads of cosmic silk, melding with his fractured core. It seeped into his very essence, wrapping around the shattered remains of his strength like a second awakening. Something deeper was happening, something that should not be possible. Another body reconstruction, a second transformation, forced upon him by the remnants of the Kraken's stolen power. This was no mere recovery. This was an evolution, a reforging of his very existence. Lucavion's unconscious form trembled. His body ignited. Two flames burst forth from him, one gray, one pitch black, raging like opposing storms that should never have coexisted. They spiraled together, coiling, devouring, reshaping. And the moment those flames touched the writhing black parasites, the cursed masses screamed. A soundless wail reverberated through the collapsing battlefield, an echo of something ancient, something that had long existed beyond the veil of reality. The parasites, those remnants of a foreign existence, were engulfed by the unnatural fire, consumed in an instant. They did not burn. They did not dissolve. They simply ceased, erased from existence. The battlefield was silent. Lucavion's body stilled, the last remnants of the flames fading into embers that whispered away into the void. His hair, once deep with streaks of silver, darkened further, absorbing the light as if the very stars had been pulled into him. His core, now reforged, pulsed with something heavier, something far more vast. The process was complete, and yet, he remained unconscious. Chapter 445, Life. Aliana's mind swam in a haze of dull, throbbing pain. Her body ached. Every muscle, every bone, every inch of her skin felt sore in a way she had never experienced before. It was a deep, heavy exhaustion, like she had been crushed beneath something immense and barely pried herself free. A groan slipped past her lips. Her thoughts were slow, sluggish. A fog clung to the edges of her mind, making it hard to think, hard to remember. But then, memory crept in. The fight, the Kraken, the void, him. Her breath hitched, her eyes snapping open. Did I die? She had accepted it. She should have died. She felt herself dying. So why? Was this the afterlife? Or hell? Aliana's blurry vision struggled to focus as she lifted her gaze, taking in her surroundings for the first time. Dark, enclosed. The walls were jagged, rough stone, stretching upward into a high ceiling barely visible in the dim light. The air was cool, damp, carrying the scent of earth and minerals. Faint droplets echoed in the distance, the sound bouncing off the cavern walls. Not the battlefield, not the endless starry abyss where the Kraken had torn the world apart. This was something else. A cave? She slowly pushed herself up, wincing as pain lanced through her limbs. What happened? Her voice was barely above a whisper, hoarse and dry. And then, a sound. A low, steady hum. Soft, faint, familiar. Aliana turned her head toward the source, and froze. A body, lying right beside her. Pitch-black hair, tangled and matted with dried blood. Torn clothes, clinging to a lean frame marked with fresh wounds and old scars. Pale skin unnaturally still in the dim light. Her breath caught. Luca! She stared, her heart pounding against her ribs. For a moment she didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, carefully, she reached out, fingers brushing against his shoulder. Luca! No response. She tried again. Hey! Still nothing. Her stomach twisted. He was breathing. His chest rose and fell in slow, uneven motions, but he wasn't waking up. Her fingers curled against his torn sleeve. Eliana swallowed hard, ignoring the ache in her throat as she took in his state. The wounds, the bruises, the sheer exhaustion carved into every inch of his body. He had pushed himself far beyond his limits. And now, he was unconscious. Her grip on his sleeve tightened. What the hell had happened? Did we win? Eliana's gaze flickered to Luca's unmoving form, then back to her own hands. The last thing she could remember was that final slash. The moment space itself seemed to shatter under the weight of his attack. And then, nothing. But the fact that they were here, alive, meant that something had worked. Right? It must have. She exhaled shakily, trying to push away the lingering uncertainty. Her body still ached, but as she carefully shifted her weight, pressing her palms against the cold stone beneath her, she realized something strange. She wasn't struggling. Her limbs weren't trembling. Her breath wasn't shallow. Normally, even after resting, her body, frail and weakened from years of illness, would still resist movement. But now, Eliana slowly, cautiously, pushed herself up to her feet, and nothing fought against her. No dizziness, no weakness. I feel stronger? The thought sent a chill down her spine. She pressed a hand to her chest. Her heartbeat was steady, too steady. This wasn't normal. Not for her. Had she really just rested? Or had something changed? She swallowed hard, pushing that question aside for now. Luca was still unconscious, and she needed to assess their surroundings. Her amber eyes swept across the cavern. It was vast, larger than she had first realized. The dim lighting made it hard to gauge the full scale of the space, but she could make out jagged rock formations, high ceilings, and shadowed tunnels stretching into darkness. The air was cool, filled with the scent of damp stone and something else, something faintly metallic. Eliana took slow steps, testing her newfound stability. Her boots echoed softly against the cave floor as she moved further from where Luca lay. Her fingers brushed against the rough walls as she walked, eyes scanning for any sign of life, of an exit, of anything. And then, she saw it. A massive shape, looming in the center of the cavern. A rock. Or at least that's what it looked like at first. But the closer she got, the more she realized this wasn't just any stone. It was unnatural. Smooth in some places, jagged in others. Its surface was unlike anything she had ever seen before. Faint, twisting engravings covered its form, marks that seemed more carved than naturally formed. Symbols she couldn't quite interpret, but Eliana's breath caught. She had seen them before. The same engravings, the same strange script. From that place, the moment she was teleported, her pulse quickened. What is this? She reached out hesitantly, fingertips grazing the surface. The stone was cool, too cool, almost like ice despite the cavern's temperature. But aside from that, it was nothing. No reaction, no shift in the air, no strange pulse beneath her fingertips. Just cold. Eliana exhaled, stepping back from the strange rock. No, not a rock. Something else. Something wrong. But whatever it wasn't doing anything. She lingered for a moment longer, half expecting the engravings to suddenly glow or the stone to hum with energy. But nothing happened. It remained still, lifeless. TCH. With a soft shake of her head, she turned away. She wandered further into the cavern, her steps slow, cautious. It didn't take long for her to realize just how deep underground they were. The air was heavier here, older. The walls stretched high, vanishing into darkness, and the tunnels that branched off in different directions held no sign of life. But there were marks. Not fresh, not recent, but something had been here before. The faintest scratches on the stone floor, a few indents on the walls, as if tools had been driven into them at some point. No footprints, no tracks, just traces. She narrowed her eyes. How long have we been here? She had no sense of time, no idea how long she had been unconscious. Her gaze drifted back toward where she had come from, toward where he was. With a small sigh, she turned and made her way back. Luca was still asleep when she returned. Unmoving, breathing slow and steady, Eliana stood there for a moment, arms crossed, watching him. Strange. He looked at ease, completely vulnerable, and that wasn't like him at all. This was a man who moved like a phantom in battle, who always seemed to be a step ahead of everything. Someone who played with danger like it was a game, who acted like he was untouchable, arrogant, unpredictable, impossible to read. But now he was just asleep. The steady rise and fall of his chest, the way his dark lashes rested against his skin, the small, almost imperceptible twitches of his fingers every now and then, as if his body still wasn't fully relaxed. Eliana let out a quiet breath before sitting down beside him. Her fingers curled against her knees as she lowered herself to the cool stone. She could still feel the dull ache in her limbs, but it wasn't unbearable. Silence stretched between them, and as much as she hated it, she found herself thinking about everything, about him, the way he smirked, the way he fought, the way he never seemed to take things seriously, until the moment he did. His voice, his laughter, that ridiculous way he always managed to infuriate her without even trying. And those words, those last words. He wanted me to hate him. She wasn't sure. It was just a feeling, a speculation. But her fingers tightened. It made sense, didn't it? Everything he had said. The way he had forced those words out. How his smirk had twitched. How his eyes had been red. How, even now, he was asleep in front of her. Are you really? She really couldn't figure it out. Chapter 446. Sleep. Eliana exhaled, her fingers absently tightening against her knees. Her mother's words drifted through her mind once again. My daughter, one day, you will meet someone who will be the sole reason for you to live. Never let go of that person. And she knew. It was him, Lucavion. The way he had stood in front of her. The way he hadn't backed down. The way he had fought, even when his body was barely holding together. Even now, she could see it. His injuries. Some of them had healed, but not completely. There were patches of torn skin, faint remnants of gashes that had been deep enough to cut to the bone. His breathing was steady, but every now and then, it hitched, just slightly, just enough to tell her that his body was still recovering. And back then, back when he had fought the Kraken, he had been in far worse shape. Eliana clenched her jaw. She knew. Luca could have let her die. He could have fought differently. He could have avoided injury, could have fought more efficiently if he hadn't stood there, if he hadn't chosen to shield her. Not on my watch. Little Ember. Watch closely. I prepared this solely for you. Those were the things he had said. And he had been smiling. That damned smile. It hadn't been his usual smirk. The one dripping with arrogance. The one that masked every intention, every thought. No, it had been real. Eliana knew. She had gotten better at reading people over the years. Her illness had forced her into a life of observation, into noticing the smallest shifts in expression, the tiny hesitations in people's voices. She had always known that Luca's smiles were fake. Most of them, at least. But that one had been genuine. This guy, she muttered under her breath, narrowing her eyes slightly. Her gaze drifted over him again, taking in the way he was curled up on the ground, his usually sharp features softened by unconsciousness. For someone so ridiculous, so insufferable, he looked almost innocent. Eliana hesitated. Then, slowly, she reached out and poked his cheek. Soft, smooth. Luca didn't stir. She poked again. Nothing. A small huff of air left her nose, something dangerously close to amusement. He can't lie at all, she murmured. Not with his words, not with his face, not with his actions. Even though he tried, even though he was so convinced that he could. She sat there for a moment, staring at him. Then, without really thinking, she muttered, "Idiot." And for the first time in a long time, she didn't say it with hatred. Stupid. Eliana narrowed her eyes at him, her fingers absently curling against the cool stone beneath her. Lucavion's words echoed in her head again. In the end, you're nothing but bait. Was this always your plan? Was I just a tool to you? She had screamed those words at him, her entire body writhing with pain and fury, and his response had been just as sharp, just as cruel. I indeed used you, and can you do anything about it? At the time, she had barely registered anything beyond those words. The raw betrayal had drowned out all reason, all logic. She had wanted to kill him. She still wanted to kill him. But now that she was calm, now that she could actually think, she replayed the words in her mind. I used you. That much was true. She was bait. That Kraken had come for her. Luca had forced her into a situation where she would act as the trigger. But was I just a tool to you? That was the real question. And had he actually said yes to that? No, he hadn't. He had evaded it. Not a confirmation. Not a denial. Just his usual way of avoiding things. And then there was all the things you said about being different. They were just lies, weren't they? She had asked him that, begged for an answer, and his response? What do you think? He hadn't said yes. He hadn't even said no. He had just thrown the question back at her. Ileana clenched her jaw. This stupid, dog-like bastard. She knew now. He had been trying to make her hate him. All of it. The cruel words, the indifference, the smirk that had looked so mocking. It was a lie. A shitty, pathetic attempt at deception. And she had fallen for it. You're so stupid, she muttered under her breath. Her fingers twitched. And then, she pinched his cheek. Hard. The soft skin squished slightly under her grip. His face still completely relaxed in sleep. Still unconscious. Still looking way too innocent for the bastard he truly was. Ileana exhaled sharply, shaking her head. Idiot, she mumbled again. And yet, even as she insulted him, she didn't pull away. Ileana's fingers twitched. Cold. Lucavion's skin was unexpectedly cold to the touch. Not just cool, cold. Her brows furrowed. That wasn't normal. Most awakened carried a certain warmth in their bodies, especially after a battle like that. Their mana alone would generate enough heat to stave off the cold. But him? His cheek, his neck, his entire body, cold. Incredibly cold. Almost unnatural. Why? Her thoughts flickered. Lucavion was strong. Beyond strong. The kind of monster that could stand against impossible odds, that could wield forces beyond human comprehension. So why did he feel like this? Was it a condition? Some side effect of his power? Her fingers absently trailed lower, brushing against his wrist. Then his hand. Cold. Even colder. For some reason, something inside her twisted. Felt familiar. A long-buried memory surfaced. Unbidden. Mother, your hands are cold. A soft voice from her past. A fleeting moment. Her mother's hand resting against her forehead. Gentle yet chilling. Her mother's hands had always been cold. Just like this. Ileana's breath hitched. Before she could dwell on it further, she felt movement beneath her fingertips. And then, Mother, a whisper. Low, faint, barely audible. But she was sure that she had heard it. Came from Luca, who was lying there like this. Am I still a disappointment? Ileana froze. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Her breath caught in her throat. What? Her grip on his hand instinctively tightened. Her mind raced, trying to process what she had just heard. Had he? No, he was unconscious. But that voice, it wasn't the usual Luca. Not the arrogant, teasing bastard she had fought beside. Not the smug, insufferable menace who smirked at everything. It was something else. Something raw. Something small. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. What the hell had she just heard? Chapter 447. Sleep. 2. Am I still a disappointment? What the hell had she just heard? Just listen to me once. Ileana's breath caught. Lucavion's grip tightened around her hand. It was weak, unsteady, but desperate. Just once. His fingers trembled against her skin, cold and uncertain. And then, he let go. His hand slipped away, but his body still shook. A faint tremor ran through him, almost imperceptible, like a man struggling against something unseen, something deep inside himself. Eliana stared. This was strange. Lucavion was supposed to be untouchable. He was supposed to be that grinning, infuriating, arrogant bastard. The one who tore through monsters like they were nothing. The one who fought with reckless, impossible confidence. But this was just a man, a human, and for some reason, she liked this version of him more. She liked him more like this. Her fingers twitched. Before she could even think, her hand moved, almost of its own accord. She reached out, brushed her fingertips lightly against his hair, and then, slowly, gently, she pulled his head onto her lap. A small breath left her lips. "I'm here." The words slipped out naturally, before she even realized she had said them. Lucavion didn't move, didn't react, but the shaking lessened, just slightly. Warmth. Eliana didn't know how else to describe it. It wasn't like fire, wasn't the kind of heat that burned or seared, the way her body had been devoured by pain not long ago. This was different. It crept up her spine slowly, curling into the edges of her chest, settling somewhere deep inside her where she couldn't quite reach. She exhaled softly, her fingers absent-mindedly threading through Lucavion's hair, and for some reason, she couldn't stop looking at him. His face, usually set in that infuriating, arrogant smirk, was still, relaxed. The sharp lines of his features had softened in unconsciousness, making him look almost, her lips pressed together, human. She liked it. That realization sent something odd through her stomach, something twisting and unfamiliar. It was stupid, it was ridiculous, but, for the first time since meeting him, she felt a quiet, inexplicable desire. Not to fight him, not to challenge him, but to see that expression again, to keep it. She blinked. And then, it was only then that she realized. She was sitting, and his head was on her lap. Eliana stiffened. When had she done this? Her mind raced, trying to piece it together. But then, a memory surfaced, faint, gentle. A warm summer day, a garden, filled with the soft rustling of leaves, the distant hum of birds. The scent of blooming roses lingered in the air. And there, a young girl lay sprawled out in the grass, head resting comfortably on her mother's lap. "Mother, what if you never get better?" The words had come out quietly, almost like an afterthought. Her mother had stilled. Then, warm fingers brushed through her hair, soft and careful. "My little Eliana," her mother murmured, smiling down at her. "I'll be fine. You always say that." "Because it's true." Eliana had huffed, pouting. She didn't believe her. Not really. But, even so, the warmth in her mother's lap had been enough to make her close her eyes, to let herself pretend she believed it, to let herself want to believe it. She had felt so safe, so happy, even in the distance, where her father sat reading at the garden table, stiff and unreadable as ever. It hadn't mattered, because her mother had been there, because she had been warm. Eliana swallowed thickly as the memory faded, the feeling of her mother's hands still lingering in her mind. And now she was in that position. She looked down at Lucavion, at the way his breath came in slow, steady beats. For the first time, she understood. Her fingers moved again, brushing against his temple, softer this time. Her lips parted. A whisper, barely audible. "I am here." Eliana barely noticed the way he twitched, the faint shift in his body as he turned onto his back. His face, usually so smug and full of teasing, was still, but not peaceful. His mouth was slightly parted, his brows faintly drawn together, like something weighed on him even in unconsciousness. Not a smile, not even neutrality, just something unresolved. She tilted her head slightly, studying him. "What kind of life did you live, I wonder?" Her voice was quiet, barely above a whisper, spoken more to herself than him. Lucavion was an enigma, a man who could dance with death like it was a game, who could stand before impossible odds and laugh. A man who had forced his way into her life, who had used her, tricked her, who had saved her. Even now, the thought unsettled her. She still wanted answers, still wanted to scream at him for all the things he'd done. But at the same time, her eyes traced the faint rise and fall of his chest, the way his body still carried tension even in sleep, the way his fingers occasionally twitched against the stone. He had burdens, didn't he? Things he didn't say, things he didn't show. Eliana exhaled softly, and for the first time, she let herself really look at him. And that's when she saw it. The scar. It ran down the length of his right eye, a clean, sharp cut. Too precise to be from a monster's claws, too smooth to be from an accident. A blade. Her lips pressed together. This scar. I wonder how you got it. Without thinking, she reached out. Her fingers ghosted over his cheek, barely touching at first. Then, carefully, she traced the line of the scar. Felt different. Not like the rest of his skin. The normal parts of his face were smooth, softer than she had expected, warmer than she thought he would be. But the scar, it was raised, slightly rigid beneath her fingertips, a texture foreign to the rest of him. Not fresh, but not fully faded either. Old yet not forgotten. The skin beneath it had a certain tightness, as if it had been cut so deeply that it never fully returned to normal. A wound meant to last. Her throat felt dry. This wasn't just some mark. It wasn't like the scrapes or bruises he earned in battle and brushed off with a smirk. This had been intentional. Who gave this to you? She didn't realize how long she had been touching it until she felt him stir beneath her fingertips. Her fingers lingered against the scar a moment longer before they drifted, sliding upward, sinking into his hair. Soft, softer than she expected. For someone who fought like a monster, who moved like a phantom, his hair was surprisingly smooth. A few strands had fallen over his face, the length slightly longer than she remembered, unruly from all the chaos they had been through. Eliana absently ruffled it, her fingers combing through the dark strands, pushing them away from his closed eyes. And then, Lucavion shifted. Not much, just the faintest movement, a small tilt of his head into her touch. His body, so tense even in unconsciousness, relaxed, just slightly, just enough to be noticeable. And that was funny. The laugh escaped before she could even know it. The laugh that didn't appear in her face for a long time. Chapter 448. Waking up. Small, soft, but real. She bit her lip, trying to suppress the ridiculous amusement bubbling in her chest. But it was impossible. You, she murmured, her voice light, almost teasing. You get comfortable way too easily. Even now, even like this, he was just him. Infuriating. Impossible. And yet, her other hand moved. Without thinking, she reached forward, her fingertips brushing against his lips. Soft. A different kind of softness. Eliana stilled. The realization hit a second too late. What am I doing? But she didn't pull away. Not yet. She just watched. Watched the way his lips barely parted. The slow rise and fall of his chest. The way his breath tickled against her fingertips. And for the first time since meeting him, she didn't know what she wanted to do next. Eliana swallowed, her breath catching in her throat. Her fingers were still resting against his lips, the warmth of his breath barely grazing her skin. Her heart pounded. What am I doing? She didn't pull away. Rather, did she know exactly what she was doing? The thought crept in, slow, insidious. Should I get my payback? After all, hadn't he done so many unimaginable things to her? Lied to her, used her, thrown cruel words at her just to see her rage? He made her feel things she didn't understand. And she hated that. So shouldn't she take something back? Eliana's lips curled slightly. Right? She murmured. Her fingers trailed from his lips to his jaw, barely grazing along his skin. This is payback. He needed to pay her back for all of it. Every smirk, every lie, every time he had seen through her, despite how much she wanted to keep him out. Even if she understood now, even if she knew why he had done it, still hurt. She couldn't just forget. She wouldn't. Yes, That was all the justification she needed. Her fingers tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, her breath slightly unsteady. Slowly, carefully, she leaned down, her heart slamming against her ribs with every inch she closed between them. Her first time doing something like this, and with him of all people. Her lips hovered just above his. A single inch left. Then, gold met black. Lucavion's eyes opened. Eliana froze, wide awake. Lucavion stared directly at her, his usual smirk nowhere to be found. For the first time, he looked utterly, completely still. For a moment, neither of them moved. Lucavion stared, his mind momentarily blank, black eyes locked onto the stunned amber ones inches away from his face. Ha! Eliana's breath hitched. A small sound, ah, slipped past her lips, barely audible but enough to break the stillness between them. She could feel it now, the warmth of his breath brushing against her skin, the way his pupils dilated just slightly, the flicker of something unguarded in his expression. Too close, too close. Her mind caught up a second too late. A sharp jolt of realization shot through her, and in an instant, she jerked her head back, breaking the proximity, her breath coming a little unsteady. Her fingers twitched where they still hovered over him, as if unsure whether to move away entirely or pretend nothing had happened. Lucavion remained still, not smirking, not laughing, just looking at her. The silence stretched unbearably. Then, he exhaled, blinking once, then twice. His head tilted ever so slightly, as if assessing the situation, and then, control. Like a switch flipping, his expression began to shift. Lucavion shook his head, as if physically discarding whatever had momentarily unsettled him. The flicker of genuine surprise faded, replaced with something more composed, something calculated. A slow inhale, a beat, and then, the smirk returned. Not all at once, but in pieces. The faintest curl of his lips, the lazy tilt of his head, the familiar glint in his eyes that said, "Ah, I see how it is." The amusement curled at the edges of his lips as he exhaled, slow and deliberate. Eliana was still too stunned to react, her wide amber eyes locked onto him in mortification. Then, Oya. His voice came out smooth, teasing, his smirk deepening as the situation fully settled in. "I wonder what's happening here?" Eliana stiffened instantly. She could feel the mockery laced in his words, the way he was already turning this around, like she had been the one caught doing something suspicious. Lucavion, of course, wasn't done. His black eyes flickered to the side and then lower. Her navel. From where he lay, his line of sight was directly aligned with the exposed skin between her slightly disheveled clothing. His gaze lingered for just a second longer than necessary, something about it slow and assessing, and, infuriatingly, just a little lecherous. Eliana felt the exact moment he made the observation. His lips twitched and then, getting a lap pillow from a beauty, how lucky I am. A sharp, unbearable heat rushed to her face. This guy. Her fists clenched. Lucavion, entirely unbothered, shifted slightly, as if getting comfortable. "But I guess." His head tilted back against her thighs, his smirk lazy and insufferable. "I earned it. Earned it. That was it." Eliana's embarrassment snapped into rage. Without hesitation, she pushed at his head, aiming to shove him off her lap with full force. But Lucavion, of course, was too damn fast. The instant she moved, he dodged. Like a phantom, his body twisted just enough to avoid her shove, his head shifting with that irritating, effortless ease, as if he had been expecting it. Eliana's palm hit empty air, and then, he laughed. A light chuckle, annoyingly amused, black eyes sharp with mischief. My. Lucavion's smirk deepened as he peered up at her, eyes half-lidded with amusement. "Why are you getting angry now?" His voice was mocking, silky, and filled with obvious enjoyment at her flustered state. Eliana's fingers twitched. She was going to kill him. Eliana's hand clenched into a fist. She could still feel it, his breath warm against her skin, the lingering sensation of her fingertips brushing against his lips. The realization was burning into her, searing, twisting into something unbearable. And then this bastard had the audacity to smirk like that. Why are you getting angry now? That voice, mocking, silky, filled with insufferable, unbearable amusement. She snapped. Why am I getting angry? Her voice rose, sharp with incredulity. Are you really asking that now? Lucavion's grin widened. You were leaning in quite eagerly just a moment ago, weren't you? Eliana's entire body locked up. You! Chapter 449, Promise. You! Her mind screeched to a halt. Heat, unbearable, furious heat surged to her face, spreading down her neck, burning through every nerve in her body. Leaning in, she had her hands curled into fists, violently suppressing the memory of how close she had been, how she had been the one to reach for him first. Her lips parted, ready to scream, ready to strangle him, ready to do something, and then she saw it, that flicker. Beneath the teasing, beneath the amusement, beneath the insufferable Lucaness of it all, there was something else, something behind his smirk, something almost expectant, like he was waiting for her anger, like he needed it. Eliana's breath caught, and then suddenly everything clicked. Her fury didn't vanish. No, it still burned, still boiled under her skin, but now she understood. She took a slow, deliberate breath, forcing herself to steady her trembling hands. Then, slowly, she leaned forward. Lucavion's smirk twitched, but he didn't move. Eliana's voice dropped lower, laced with something sharp and knowing. You really did it on purpose, huh? His grin didn't falter. Did what on purpose? Eliana's glare was scorching. It wasn't just anger now, it was demanding, relentless, the kind of gaze that dug deep, forcing answers where there were none given. Lucavion held her stare, his black eyes sharp, gleaming, but unreadable. Those words you said, did you do everything on purpose? Did you really mean all those things? She was pushing forward. She had to. Lucavion let out a quiet chuckle, his smirk widening slightly as he lifted a hand. Casual, almost lazy. What do you think? It was an answer that wasn't an answer. A dodge, a deflection. His favorite way of twisting things around, letting her decide what to believe. But this time, she refused to let him. Eliana's jaw tightened. No, she snapped. Don't evade the question. She moved suddenly, her body tense as she stood up, breaking all distance between them. Her voice rose, her anger surging, her breath unsteady. Answer me. Lucavion blinked, watching her from where he still lay, as if mildly entertained by her outburst. Answer what? His voice remained maddeningly smooth. Eliana's fingers curled into fists. Did you mean all those things or not? A pause, a slow inhale, and then Lucavion's expression shifted. It was subtle, barely there, a small flicker in his eyes, something indecipherable just beneath the surface. Then slowly he sat up. Their gazes remained locked, the space between them electric with tension. Finally, what if I say I did? His voice was softer now, quieter. No teasing, no mockery, just a question. What will you do then? Silence. Eliana froze. Her heart pounded. What will you do then? The words sank into her bones, curling into something she didn't know how to hold. Eliana stared. Her breath felt too tight, her heartbeat a sharp, uneven rhythm pounding in her ears. The heat of her anger was still there, hot, furious. But beneath it, beneath all of it, she felt lost. What am I supposed to do? If he really meant it, if he truly, deliberately, intentionally used her, then what? Would she hate him more? Would she strike him down right here? Would she walk away? Would she? Her fingers twitched. A deep part of her, a part she did not want to acknowledge, knew the answer. She wouldn't. She wouldn't walk away. She wouldn't strike him. She wouldn't leave. She was too deep in this already. And that realization was unbearable. Her fists clenched at her sides. Fury burned hot in her veins. But it wasn't simple anymore. It wasn't just the fire of rage. It was betrayal, frustration, confusion. All of it twisting together into something that made her feel small. Eliana inhaled sharply, the sound shaking slightly against the silence. Her voice, when it came, was low, sharp, but unsteady. "Then I will never forgive you." Lucavion's black eyes flickered. For just a second, a fraction of a second, something passed through his expression. Something she almost caught, almost grasped. Then, he smiled. Not a smirk, not his usual arrogant, teasing, insufferable grin. A smile. Slow, almost thoughtful, but not kind. Eliana felt something heavy settle in her chest. Why do I feel like he was waiting for me to say that? She hated it. She hated how uncertain she suddenly felt. Eliana's amber eyes burned into him, sharp and unrelenting. Lucavion didn't look away. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. Her fury, her uncertainty, her demand for something, anything real, clashing against the calm, unreadable depth of his black irises. Then, "Is that so?" His voice was quiet, smooth, too smooth. Lucavion tilted his head slightly, the faintest shift of movement as his gaze flickered away. "That is good then." And just like that, he turned. Eliana's body locked up. Her breath caught in her throat. "What? You?" Her voice hitched. Then it snapped. "What?" Lucavion didn't even flinch at her outburst. He merely glanced back at her, golden eyes gleaming faintly, as if she was making too big of a deal out of this. "You're just going to say that and turn your head?" "Yep." His lips curled slightly, that infuriating nonchalance wrapping around him like armor. "Is there anything else I'm supposed to say?" Eliana saw red. "There is, you bastard." Before she even registered the movement, she was already storming forward, her hands grabbing his arm, yanking him back toward her. Lucavion didn't resist, didn't flinch, didn't even try to avoid her grip. He merely blinked, tilting his head slightly, as if mildly curious about what she was about to do. But Eliana didn't care. Didn't care about his damn smirks. Didn't care about his usual evasive nonsense. Didn't care about the fact that her hands were shaking as they clenched around him. All she cared about was the rage boiling in her chest. The raw, aching confusion that refused to let her go. "All those promises you made." Her voice shook. "All those things you told me about not giving up on life." Lucavion's smirk faded. Eliana's grip tightened. "The promise about curing me." She pulled him closer, forcing him to look at her. "What the hell are they about then?" Her heart was pounding. She needed to know. Eliana's fingers were digging into his arm, trembling with frustration, with confusion, with everything he had forced her to feel. Her voice had cracked. Her breath was uneven. And yet, even as she glared up at him, demanding answers, demanding something real, Lucavion smiled. It wasn't his usual smirk. It wasn't the playful arrogance she had come to expect from him. No, this was different. A slow, meaningful smile. One laced with something quietly knowing, and just a little playful. "Did you not notice?" Eliana's brows furrowed. "Notice what?" Lucavion chuckled softly, the sound vibrating in his chest. Then, he laughed. Not loud, not mocking, just a small, inward laugh, as if he found something about this moment deeply amusing. Eliana bristled. "This bastard." And then, he moved. His hand flicked to the side, reaching into thin air, no, into his spatial storage. Eliana instinctively tensed, her grip on his arm tightening, half expecting a trick, but instead, Lucavion pulled out something small, something round, something silver. "Here." He extended it toward her, palm open. Eliana's eyes flickered downward. A mirror. Her heart skipped. Slowly, cautiously, she reached for it, her fingers brushing against the cool surface as she lifted it into her hands. For a moment, she hesitated. Then, she looked, and the second she did, her world stopped. Her breath hitched. Her amber eyes widened. The mirror shook slightly in her grasp as she stared, as she processed what she was seeing. No, what she wasn't seeing. No dark veins. No sunken pallor. No fragile, deathly thin complexion. Her skin was healthy, clear, as if she had never been sick at all. The mirror trembled in her hands. Her pulse roared in her ears. And then, Lucavion's voice, soft and terribly amused, broke the silence. Congratulations. She turned to him, her expression shattered, disbelieving. You're cured now. Chapter 450. Promise. 2. Silence. The dim light of the cave barely reflected off the mirror's surface, but even in the darkness, she could see it. Her fingers trembled as they traced the edge of the mirror, her reflection staring back at her. Foreign and yet unmistakably hers. Her skin. Smooth, clear. Not sickly, not pale. Not the fragile, exhausted face she had seen her entire life. Lucavion's voice hummed lightly beside her. Ah, wait. You can't see right. Before she could even question him, his hand moved, fingers flicking with an effortless grace. And then, light, a soft, gentle glow spilled from his palm, washing over them in a quiet, steady starlight. The cave brightened. The mirror in her hands gleamed. And in that moment, she saw everything. Her skin, smooth, radiant, as if she had been sculpted from untouched light. Her cheeks no longer sunken with sickness. Her eyes, clear, bright, golden amber, like molten fire instead of dull exhaustion. Her lips, her nose, the sharp lines of her jaw, all of it, whole, healthy, like she had never suffered at all. Ah! The world blurred. Her vision swam, her breath stuttering in her chest. She felt it before she realized it. A single tear, warm, silent, slipped down her cheek. What? Her fingers curled tightly around the mirror, as if it might disappear if she didn't hold on. From beside her, Lucavion's voice came, smooth and steady. See. Her throat closed. Her body shook. Not from fear, not from sickness, but from something so much heavier. Am I? Her voice cracked. Am I really cured? Lucavion's golden gaze met hers. He nodded, slow, deliberate. Yes, you are. Eliana's fingers clenched tighter. Really? Her voice wavered, breathless. This is not a dream, right? Lucavion tilted his head slightly, and then smirked. Mocking. Teasing. Can't you feel it? Eliana staggered. Her knees felt weak, her body light, her thoughts fraying at the edges. Really? The words tumbled from her lips, whispered, raw, desperate, as if saying them out loud would make it real. And then, memories, crashing down like an avalanche. The countless treatments, the endless, suffocating expectations. The voices of doctors, healers, alchemists. This medicine should help. She might improve with time. There is a new treatment from the capital. We cannot guarantee results. We have done all we can. And the worst of them, I'm sorry. There's nothing more we can do. She had long stopped hoping. She had long stopped believing. And yet, it had been Lucavion who had ignited that hope again, only to shatter it, to make her doubt, to make her hurt. Her fingers tightened around the mirror. Her lips trembled, and for the first time, she didn't know whether to scream at him or cry. She couldn't believe it. She refused to believe it. This had to be a trick, a lie, another cruel, elaborate deception. Lucavion was a master at twisting words, at playing with people, at making her feel things she didn't want to feel. So how could she trust him now? Her grip on the mirror tightened, her heart slamming against her ribs. He's lying. He has to be lying. He had given her hope before, only to rip it away. What if this was just another game? What if he was using her again, feeding her false dreams just to break her down later? Eliana's breath shook. Her voice wavered, filled with something raw, something vulnerable. I don't believe you. Lucavion didn't look offended, didn't look surprised, didn't even try to argue. Instead, he smiled, a small, knowing smile, one that made something deep inside her chest tighten. And then he spoke. Can't you really feel it? Eliana blinked. Lucavion tilted his head slightly, his black eyes gleaming as he continued, his voice smooth, patient, as if he was waiting for her to understand on her own. Like how easily you can move? Her breath hitched. Normally before. His voice was quiet, steady. Whenever you needed to move, you would be slow and tired. And I. His lips curled slightly. I would have to carry you. Most of the time. Eliana's fingers twitched. But now, isn't it different? Lucavion's eyes never left her. Can't you feel the vitality? Like now. You can finally feel the strength in your body? His words sank into her skin. You can finally breathe clearly, without coughing, without feeling like your lungs are burning, without struggling to take in air. Eliana stilled. Like how you no longer feel the need to scratch yourself? Her eyes widened. Have you not noticed those? And suddenly, everything clicked. That strange feeling she had woken up with, the lightness in her limbs, the absence of pain, the way she had stood up so easily, the way she had yelled at him without gasping for breath, the way her body wasn't shaking, aching, screaming at her to stop. Her hands weren't trembling. Her chest wasn't tight. She felt whole. And the realization knocked the air from her lungs. Her breath shuddered. Her fingers dug into the mirror, gripping it so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She could feel it. She could feel it. The strength in her body, the energy flowing through her limbs, the complete absence of the weakness, the pain, the exhaustion that had been her reality for so long. And yet, she couldn't stop shaking. She couldn't control her face, couldn't stop her lips from trembling, couldn't hold back the way her vision blurred. Tears, they welled up too fast, too suddenly. She bit down on her lip, desperately trying to keep herself together, to keep from breaking, to keep from... You don't need to hold it in, you know? Lucavion's voice was quiet, smooth, unshaken. It's just me and you here. Eliana froze. Her vision swam. Her fingers curled tighter. Lucavion watched her, his black eyes steady, calm, knowing. And then he smiled. But if you don't want me, he added lightly, teasing but not cruel, I can turn my head and close my ears. That was what broke her. A choked sound escaped her throat, and before she could stop herself, her legs gave out. She fell to her knees, and the tears came, unstoppable, relentless. The kind of tears that weren't loud, weren't dramatic, but simply poured down her cheeks, onto her hands, onto the mirror. She couldn't stop them. She didn't know how to. Lucavion tilted his head slightly, his voice quiet, soft, but still carrying that infuriating amusement. Then softly, too softly, see. His voice reached her through the haze of her shaking breaths. Haven't I kept my promise? Eliana squeezed her eyes shut, her fingers tightening on the mirror, her breath shuddering as another sob escaped. Lucavion's voice lowered, smooth, steady, assured. Aren't you cured? A broken, breathless sound left her lips, and then she sobbed.
Hello everyone. We now have a Discord server. Join us for faster updates, discussions about your favorite novels, and exclusive Discord-only content. Don't miss out. See you there. Scan the QR code on the screen or enter any of the displayed links into your browser to join our Discord.